And finally, is it right to take the Lord's Supper alone? And I'm glad that Sam kind of laid the foundation here, because so many of the principles that Sam dealt with in dealing with holidays and so forth, obviously the Lord's Supper, we're not talking about a holiday, but some of the principles carry over into this discussion right here. Because I've known of preachers, had conversations with some who said, absolutely you cannot, must not partake of the Lord's Supper alone. He'd say, well, what about the Ethiopian eunuch, on his way down to Ethiopia, and there wasn't a church? Well, he could partake of the Lord's Supper by himself because they say he was the church in prospect. Or what about the Apostle Paul when he was on that journey to Rome, the shipwreck and all of that? Oh, they will tell you, absolutely not. No way could Paul have partaken of the Lord's Supper on that ship. And if you ask them why, well, the answer is because every example in the New Testament that you'll find when disciples are partaking of the Lord's Supper, they're together when they do that. And that sounds, again, like the simple answer. I'm not sure that's the complete answer, though, to be honest with you. Every time you find an example of disciples coming together in the Lord's to partake of the Lord's Supper, they're also in an upper room. Somebody says, well, preacher, that's completely irrelevant. I got that. But if it's strictly about the examples, if that's the only thing we're going by, then you might need to pay attention to that too. Well, we're not going to do that. We understand that. It is a consideration that disciples came together. Yep, we need to take that into account. That was the norm. And it certainly facilitates our ability to proclaim the Lord's death until he comes. Sam has already referenced 1 Corinthians chapter 11, but in that passage, as Paul was describing what we do when we come together to partake of the Lord's Supper, and again, he does mention the coming together, is that we proclaim the Lord's death until he comes. Well, of course, you cannot preach, and that's the word there, proclaim. You cannot preach to an empty room. You can't do that. And so there is that aspect of the Lord's Supper that would demand an assembling of saints together. But proclaiming the Lord's death is not the only purpose that is served in the partaking of the Lord's Supper. As Sam has already mentioned, the Lord's Supper is also a memorial feast. It is a feast wherein we remember what Christ has done for us. And if you want to go back to the Old Testament to learn principles of how it is that we should deal with situations like that, how about going back to the book of Numbers? Because in Numbers chapter 9 and in verse 6, the record tells us that there were some men who were unclean because they had touched a dead body, and so they were not able to partake of the Passover on that day when it was prescribed, when they were supposed to partake of it. And so they come to Moses and said, what do we do? And so the Lord made what I would call a merciful provision for these individuals who were unable to partake of the Lord's Supper. And what they did is they said, I tell you what, on the next month, on the same day, you can partake of it then. We'll call that good. A merciful provision for those individuals who were unable to partake of the memorial feast on the day that it was prescribed. He goes on to say in verse 13, though, and he clarifies, if anyone who is clean and is able fails to keep the Passover, that person shall be cut off from his people. Passover was a serious memorial, and people were expected to partake of it, but if they were not able to partake of it, there was a merciful provision. It was a merciful allowance for unavoidable circumstances. And so maybe the question comes up, why would you be alone when you partake of the Lord's Supper? What is the circumstance? And again, this kind of goes back to some of the things Sam was talking about. Exactly what are the circumstances? Because not every circumstance is the same. If you didn't partake of the Lord's Supper because you decided the fish were biting, we got a problem. Obviously, the Lord would look askance at that excuse for not assembling with the saints together. That would be a problem. But what if you're sick? We've had quite a number of our members here who have been sick over the last several weeks, unavoidably unable to be here with the people of God. There are some who are called out to work, again, not because they want to, but because things have happened on the job and they have to be present there. Again, sometimes circumstances arrive where we are not able to partake. Well, if the principles of the book of Numbers are any guidance at all, maybe we need to make merciful provisions for those individuals, which is, by the way, I think exactly what we do when we offer the Lord's Supper on Sunday night. That is a merciful provision. Not that our tradition makes it right, but what we have done all my life in every congregation I've been a part of is that on Sunday night, if you were not able to partake of the Lord's Supper on Sunday morning, we will mercifully allow you that opportunity on Sunday night. This is not a second serving of the Lord's Supper. It is a second opportunity for someone who maybe was not able to partake of it on that morning. So we understand the concept of making merciful provisions. And so when it comes down to answering this question, what about when you're alone? What, are you sick? I know sometimes there are brethren who will bring the Lord's Supper to an individual. Well, they're not alone anymore, are they? Doesn't that kind of do away with the problem? If somebody brings them the Lord's Supper, but what happens if you are truly alone in the confines of your own house and you are taking the Lord's Supper? Well, obviously you're not preaching or proclaiming the Lord's death until he comes, because you're not able to do that under those circumstances. But can you be reminded, can you remember the Lord's death on that occasion? Well, of course you can. In the end, and this again comes back to one of the principles that Sam mentioned, in the end it comes down to your conscience, your personal conscience. My father-in-law had a terminal liver disease the last several months of his life. He was unable to assemble with the saints. We would meet with him on Sundays, and we would have a little lesson, and we would sing together, we would pray, we'd do all that. He refused to partake of the Lord's Supper. I felt sorry for him, although that's no reason for doing anything, but it bothered me that he was not able to partake of the memorial feast because of his circumstances. But his conscience wouldn't let him do that. And so in the end, that is what it comes down to. It is a Romans 14 question, and so you're going to have to make that decision on your own, whether or not to take of the Lord's Supper alone. I do believe that the principles of the Old Testament point to God's merciful provisions for those who are unable to partake of it themselves.